I installed cameras after the break-in. Now I know why the intruder looked so familiar. The police said I was lucky. Lucky that I'd been at my sister's house when someone shattered my kitchen window and ransacked 3 rooms. Lucky that nothing irreplaceable was taken. Just my laptop, some cash from the drawer, my grandfather's watch. Officer Delgado filled out the report while I stood in my living room looking at overturned furniture and scattered papers. He said break-ins were common in this neighborhood, that I should install a security system and move on. I nodded and signed the paperwork, but something felt wrong. The intruder had ignored my television and expensive speakers. They'd taken specific items and left others worth more money. Delgado said criminals were unpredictable, that I shouldn't try to find logic in chaos. He handed me a case number and left. I called my brother Kevin that night. He worked in tech security and knew everything about cameras and alarm systems. He came over the next morning with boxes of equipment, 4 cameras covering every angle of my house, motion sensors on the windows, an app that would alert my phone the second anything moved. We spent 6 hours installing everything, running cables through the attic, mounting cameras in corners where they'd have clear sight lines. Kevin showed me how the system worked, how I could review footage from anywhere, how the motion detection was sensitive enough to catch a cat walking past. He said I'd feel safer knowing I could see everything. I thanked him, and he left, telling me to call if I needed anything else. The first 3 nights were quiet. I obsessively checked the app, watching empty rooms on my phone screen. Nothing moved except shadows from passing cars. I started to relax, started to think maybe Delgado was right about moving on. Then on the 4th night at 2 a.m, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I pulled up the app with shaking hands. The camera showed my living room, and someone was standing in the middle of it. A man in dark clothes, his face partially visible in the camera's night vision. He was looking directly at the bookshelf where I kept family photos. My heart hammered as I dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was in my house right now. The intruder didn't take anything this time. He just stood there for 3 minutes looking at the photos, then walked calmly out through the front door. The police arrived 12 minutes later. By then he was gone, but I had the footage saved. Delgado came back, this time with his partner, Officer Reeves. They watched the video on my phone, their expressions unreadable. Reeves asked if I recognized the man. I said no, but even as I said it, something nagged at me. There was something familiar in the way he moved, the angle of his shoulders. Delgado said they'd circulate the footage and increase patrols in the area. He suggested I stay with family for a few days. I refused. This was my house. I watched the footage 50 times that day, zoomed in on his face, tried to get a clear image, but the night vision made everything grainy and distorted. I sent screenshots to Kevin, asking if he could enhance them. He said he'd try, but the resolution was limited. I posted the images in a neighborhood watch group on social media, asking if anyone recognized the man. 3 people said he looked vaguely familiar but couldn't place him. Someone suggested he might be from the next town over. Another person said his build reminded them of a contractor who'd worked in the area last year. Nothing concrete, nothing useful. The 3rd break-in happened a week later. This time I was home. I was in my bedroom when the motion alert went off. The camera showed him in the kitchen, and I could see him more clearly now. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair and a lean build. He wore the same dark clothes as before. I grabbed my phone and locked my bedroom door, calling 911 again while I watched him on the app. He moved through the kitchen slowly, opening drawers, touching things but not taking them. He ran his hand along the counter where I prepared meals every day. The dispatcher said officers were 3 minutes away. I watched the man walk into the hallway, getting closer to my bedroom. My hands were sweating so badly I nearly dropped the phone. He stopped outside my bedroom door. I could see him on the hallway camera standing perfectly still. He raised his hand and knocked 3 times. Slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't breathe, didn't move. He knocked again, and I heard it through the door, the sound matching the video on my screen. He said my name, Natalie. His voice was calm, almost friendly. I know you're in there. The police sirens were getting closer, and he heard them too. He turned and walked away, out the back door this time, disappearing into the darkness of my yard. The police searched the property but found nothing. He was gone like smoke. Officer Reeves sat me down at my kitchen table and asked me to think carefully. Had I recently ended a relationship? Did I have any exes who might be obsessed? Any coworkers or acquaintances who paid too much attention? I went through my life systematically. My last boyfriend was 2 years ago, and we'd ended things amicably. He'd moved to California for work. My coworkers were mostly women, and the men I worked with were married with families. I had no stalkers, no angry exes, no rejected suitors. Reeves suggested I think about people from my past. Old friends, former neighbors, anyone who might hold a grudge. I promised to make a list, but my mind was blank. This man was a stranger. Kevin came over the next day to add more cameras. He installed one covering the back door, another in the garage, one in the yard. He upgraded the system to include facial recognition software. If the man appeared again, the system would alert me immediately and save high-quality images. Kevin asked if I wanted to stay at his place for a while. His wife had offered to make up the guest room. I considered it, but something stubborn in me refused to be driven from my own home. I'd worked too hard for this house, saved for years to afford it. Some stranger wasn't going to take that from me. Kevin understood but made me promise to keep my phone charged and nearby at all times. The footage haunted me. I watched it before bed, during my lunch break at work, any moment I had free. The way the man moved through my space with such confidence, such familiarity. He knew the layout of my house, knew which floorboards creaked and which didn't. When he'd walk down the hallway, he'd avoided the spot near the bathroom that always groaned under weight. How did he know that? I showed the footage to my coworker Diana, who'd done some amateur detective work for her true crime podcast. She watched it 3 times, her face growing more troubled. She said his body language suggested comfort, not nervousness. He wasn't acting like a stranger in someone else's home. He was acting like he belonged there. I started researching the history of my house. I'd bought it a year ago from an elderly couple who'd lived there for 30 years. Before them, the records showed a series of owners going back to when the house was built in 1985. I found names and dates, but nothing that connected to the man in my footage. I drove to the county records office and pulled property documents, looking for anything unusual. The house had been sold 6 times, each transaction normal and documented. No foreclosures, no disputes, nothing that suggested drama or conflict. I was chasing shadows, trying to find meaning in randomness. The man came back on a Thursday night. This time the camera caught him in perfect clarity. The facial recognition software locked onto him immediately, and my phone exploded with alerts. He was in my living room again, but this time he was carrying something. A photo album, old and worn. He sat on my couch and opened it, slowly turning pages. I called the police and watched him through the camera. He was looking at the photos carefully, running his finger over the images. The police arrived in 8 minutes. I heard them pounding on my front door, shouting for him to come out. He closed the album, set it on the coffee table, and walked calmly to the back door. By the time they got inside, he was gone. The photo album was mine. I recognized it immediately. It had been in a box in my garage, packed with other things from my childhood that I hadn't looked at in years. Someone had brought it into my house, but not the intruder. I had brought it in 2 days ago, planning to sort through old memories. I'd set it on the coffee table and then forgotten about it. The man had been looking at my childhood photos, pictures of me as a kid, my family, our old house, birthday parties, and school events. Officer Delgado asked if I recognized anyone in the photos who might be the intruder. I went through every page, studying faces, neighbors, family friends, my parents' coworkers. No one matched the man on camera. Diana came over that weekend to help me think through the situation. We laid out everything we knew. A man was breaking into my house repeatedly but taking nothing. He knew the layout, avoided creaky floorboards, spoke my name. He looked at family photos and brought no weapons. Diana said it felt personal, almost intimate. She asked about my childhood, whether anything traumatic had happened. I told her my childhood was normal, happy even. My parents were still married, still living in the house where I grew up. I had one brother, Kevin, who was protective but not obsessive. My extended family was small and stable. Diana suggested we go through my social media history, see if anyone had been following me online. We spent 3 hours reviewing my Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Nothing unusual. No suspicious accounts, no concerning messages. My younger sister Amanda called that evening. She was a graduate student studying psychology and had always been interested in criminal behavior. I told her everything, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked if I'd noticed any items missing that might seem insignificant. Small things that wouldn't show up on a police report. I thought about it and realized my house key had disappeared from my purse 3 months ago. I'd assumed I'd lost it and had the locks changed. Amanda said that was likely when he'd first gained access. He'd taken the key, made a copy, then returned it or disposed of it. She suggested he might have been planning this for much longer than I realized. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My mother called on Sunday afternoon, her voice strange and shaky. She asked if I'd been going through old family things recently. I told her about finding the photo album. She was quiet for a long moment, then asked me to come over. She needed to talk to me about something she should have told me years ago. I drove to my childhood home with a knot in my stomach. My father was at work, and Mom sat me down at the kitchen table. She looked older suddenly, tired in a way I'd never noticed before. She asked if I'd ever wondered why I looked so different from Kevin and Amanda. Different hair color, different build, different features. I said I'd assumed I took after distant relatives. Mom started crying. She told me that when I was 3 years old, my biological father had left, just disappeared one day, leaving her alone with a toddler and no explanation. She'd met my dad, the man I'd always known as my father, 6 months later. He'd adopted me legally when I was 4. They'd never told me because they didn't want me to feel different or unwanted. My biological father's name was Daniel Cross. Mom said she hadn't heard from him in 28 years. She had no idea where he was or what he was doing. She'd assumed he was dead or had moved on completely. I sat there processing this information, feeling like the foundation of my life had just shifted. Everything I thought I knew about my family was incomplete. I asked her what Daniel looked like. She found an old photo, yellowed and creased. My hands shook as I looked at it. The man in the photo was younger, but the resemblance to the intruder was unmistakable. Same build, same features, same way of holding his shoulders. My biological father had been breaking into my house, had been watching me, looking at photos of the daughter he'd abandoned. Mom said she didn't know how he'd found me, didn't know what he wanted. She begged me not to contact him, said anyone who abandoned their child didn't deserve a second chance. I told her I needed time to think. I drove home in a daze, everything clicking into place with horrible clarity. The cameras caught him again that night. He appeared at 11, standing in my driveway looking up at the house. He knew I had cameras now. He was staring directly at the one mounted above the garage. I pulled up the live feed and watched him. We made eye contact through the camera, though he couldn't see me. He raised one hand in a small wave. Then he turned and walked away. I saved the footage and sent it to Officer Delgado with a message. I'd identified the intruder. His name was Daniel Cross, and he was my biological father. Delgado called within 10 minutes. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. Whatever his reasons, he'd broken into my home multiple times. That was a crime. The police tracked Daniel down within 2 days. He'd been living in a motel 30 miles away, working construction under the table. They arrested him on 3 counts of breaking and entering. Officer Reeves called to tell me they had him in custody and asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement. I said I'd think about it. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Daniel had a public defender who immediately tried to contact me, saying his client wanted to explain himself. I refused to speak with either of them. Kevin was furious when he found out, demanding to know why Mom had kept this secret. Our family fractured along this fault line, everyone taking positions, assigning blame. Amanda took it differently than Kevin. She wanted to understand the psychology behind Daniel's actions, wanted to interview him for her research. I told her absolutely not, that she couldn't use our family trauma for academic purposes. She apologized but said she couldn't help being curious about what would drive a man to stalk his own daughter. Kevin accused her of being insensitive, and they didn't speak for 2 weeks. My father, the man who raised me, stayed quiet through all of it. He told me privately that he'd always feared this day might come, that Daniel might resurface. He said he'd prepared himself to lose me if I ever found out the truth. I couldn't sleep. The cameras showed empty rooms now, no intruder lurking in corners, but I felt more unsettled than before. Diana suggested I write down questions I had, things I wanted to know even if I never asked them. I filled 7 pages. Why did you leave? Why come back now? Why not just knock on the door? Why break in like a criminal? What did you think would happen? Did you think I'd welcome you? The questions felt both crucial and pointless. Nothing he said could justify abandoning a 3-year-old. Nothing could make breaking into my house seem reasonable. But I still wanted answers. That's what made me angriest. That despite everything, part of me wanted to understand. The public defender left 3 messages. Daniel wanted to see me, wanted to apologize, wanted to explain. I ignored them all. Then Mom called, crying, saying she'd gotten a letter from Daniel. He'd written to her, apologizing for leaving, explaining that he'd been 22 and terrified of being a father. He said he'd spent decades trying to build a life worth returning to, trying to become someone his daughter wouldn't be ashamed of. He'd found me through social media a year ago and had been trying to work up the courage to contact me properly. When he saw I'd bought a house in the area, he'd driven by just to see where I lived. Then he'd started doing it regularly. The break-in started because he wanted to feel close to the daughter he'd lost. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself. I read Mom's letter 3 times. The words felt manipulative, designed to generate sympathy. He'd had 28 years to work up courage. He'd chosen instead to violate my privacy and safety. The letter mentioned that he'd been watching me for a year, which meant he'd seen me living my life, going to work, having friends over. He'd watched without my knowledge or consent. That wasn't love or regret. That was obsession. I wrote a response and gave it to Officer Delgado to pass along. I told Daniel that biology didn't make him my father. The man who raised me, who taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework and walked me down the aisle at my college graduation, that was my father. Daniel was just a stranger who couldn't let go of a past he'd voluntarily abandoned. Kevin hired a private investigator to look into Daniel's background. The report came back 2 weeks later, and it was worse than we'd imagined. Daniel had a history of unstable relationships, had been fired from multiple jobs for erratic behavior. He'd been arrested twice for trespassing, once for following an ex-girlfriend. There was a restraining order from 8 years ago, though the woman who'd filed it had moved out of state. The investigator found evidence that Daniel had tried to contact his other children, 2 half-siblings I didn't know existed. A daughter in Oregon and a son in Florida, both from relationships after he'd left my mother. Neither wanted anything to do with him. The hearing arrived. I sat in the courtroom with Kevin beside me. Amanda had chosen to stay home, saying she couldn't handle seeing Daniel in person. My parents were in the back row, my father's hand gripping my mother's tightly. Daniel was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, and I forced myself to look at him. He was 51 but looked older, worn down by whatever life he'd lived. He saw me and his face crumpled. His lawyer argued that Daniel had mental health issues, that his actions came from untreated trauma and desperate longing to reconnect with his daughter. The prosecutor laid out the facts clearly. 3 documented break-ins, multiple instances of trespassing, stalking behavior spanning a year. The judge listened to both sides, then asked if I wanted to speak. I stood up, my voice steadier than I expected. I said that Daniel Cross had taught me an important lesson. He'd shown me that some people will violate your boundaries and then claim it was out of love. They'll traumatize you and expect forgiveness because they're hurting too. I said I understood he might have regrets, might wish he could undo his choices, but that didn't give him the right to break into my home. It didn't give him the right to make me afraid in the place I should feel safest. I said I wanted the full penalty under the law, and I wanted a restraining order that would last the rest of his life. The judge thanked me and said she'd make her ruling after reviewing the case details. The hearing ended, and I walked out without looking back at Daniel. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in prison and 5 years probation. The restraining order was permanent. Daniel would never be legally allowed to contact me or come within 500 feet of my home. Kevin said it wasn't enough, that he should have gotten more time, but I felt something settle in my chest. Justice didn't always mean maximum punishment. It meant consequences that matched the crime. Daniel would have time to think about what he'd done, and I would have legal protection if he ever tried again. More importantly, I had answers now. Not the answers I'd wanted, but the truth. My biological father was a broken man who'd made terrible choices and then compounded them with worse ones. Mom apologized for keeping the secret, said she'd thought she was protecting me. I told her I understood but needed time to adjust to this new reality. My relationship with my real father, the man who'd raised me, felt stronger than ever. He came over and we talked for hours about everything. He said he'd always known I might find out someday, had always worried I'd feel differently about him. I told him biology was just genetics. Family was the people who showed up, who stayed, who loved you even when it was hard. He cried, which I'd only seen him do twice in my life. We were closer after that conversation than we'd ever been before. I kept the cameras. The security system stayed active, though I checked it less obsessively. Diana helped me reclaim my space, rearranging furniture, painting the living room a new color. We hung different art, changed the curtains, made the house feel fresh and new. The memories of Daniel standing in my rooms faded gradually, replaced by new moments, better ones. I hosted game nights, had Kevin's kids over for sleepovers, filled my home with life and laughter. The break-ins became a story I told at parties, something that happened to me but didn't define me. People always asked if I regretted installing the cameras. I told them no. The cameras gave me the truth. What I did with that truth was my choice. 3 months after the sentencing, I received a package at work. No return address, just my name written in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a thumb drive and a handwritten note. The note was from Daniel, though how he'd managed to send it from prison I didn't know. It said the thumb drive contained videos he'd recorded over the past year. He wanted me to see them, to understand his perspective. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped I'd watch them anyway. I should have thrown it away immediately. Should have reported it to the police as a violation of the restraining order. Instead, I took it home. I plugged the thumb drive into my laptop that night, Kevin sitting beside me in case the content was too disturbing. The first video was dated 13 months ago. Daniel sat in a motel room, speaking directly to the camera. He explained that he'd found me through Facebook, had seen photos of my graduation, my new job, my house. He said he'd wanted to contact me properly but was terrified I'd reject him. So he'd started driving past my house just to see where I lived. The videos progressed chronologically, Daniel filming himself outside my house at different times of day, recording his thoughts about wanting to know me, wanting to be part of my life. The desperation in his voice grew with each video. The 8th video showed him entering my house for the first time. He'd found my spare key under the flower pot by the back door, a hiding spot so obvious it embarrassed me. He walked through my room slowly, touching my things, crying as he looked at photos of me growing up, photos he'd missed because he'd chosen to leave. He recorded himself sitting on my couch, talking about how proud he was of the woman I'd become, how he wished he'd been there to see it happen. Kevin wanted to stop watching, said it was too invasive, but I needed to see all of it, needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to me. The videos showed dozens of visits. Daniel coming into my house while I was at work, while I was sleeping, while I was out with friends. He'd go through my mail, read my journals, look through my closet. In one video, he cooked dinner in my kitchen, eating alone at my table, pretending we were a family. In another, he fell asleep on my couch, the camera still recording. He'd spent an entire Saturday in my house once, cleaning and organizing, leaving everything exactly as he'd found it. The violation was total and complete. Every private moment, every personal space, contaminated by his presence. The final video was dated 2 days before his arrest. Daniel sat in the same motel room, looking exhausted. He said he knew what he was doing was wrong, that he was sick and needed help, but he couldn't stop. Being in my house made him feel connected to the daughter he'd lost through his own failures. He said he'd planned to turn himself in, to confess everything, but he wanted me to have these videos first. Wanted me to see that his actions came from love, however twisted that love had become. He ended by saying he was sorry, that he understood if I hated him, but he hoped someday I might understand. The video ended. Kevin and I sat in silence. I reported the thumb drive to Officer Delgado the next morning. He was furious that Daniel had managed to send it, said they'd investigate how it had gotten out of the prison. I asked if the videos could be used to extend Daniel's sentence. Delgado said probably not, since they mostly showed him incriminating himself for crimes he was already serving time for, but the restraining order violation might add a few months. I made copies of everything before handing it over. I needed to keep the evidence, needed proof that this had really happened, that I wasn't exaggerating or misremembering how bad it had been. Amanda asked to see the videos for her research. I refused at first, but she made a compelling argument. She was writing her dissertation on parasocial relationships and boundary violations. Daniel's case was a perfect example of how delusion could justify criminal behavior. She promised to change all identifying information, to protect my privacy completely. I finally agreed, but made her watch them at my house, under my supervision. She cried through most of them, apologizing repeatedly for asking. When they ended, she said she'd never seen such a clear documentation of someone's descent into obsession. The videos would form the backbone of her research. The thumb drive incident made national news somehow. A reporter got wind of the story and wrote an article about the biological father who stalked his daughter for a year. The article painted Daniel as a tragic figure, a man destroyed by regret and mental illness. It quoted his lawyer extensively, who argued that Daniel needed treatment, not imprisonment. The article mentioned me only briefly, calling me the unnamed victim who refused to forgive. I got dozens of messages from strangers, some supporting me, others calling me heartless for not giving Daniel a second chance. The attention was overwhelming and unwanted. Diana suggested I write my own account, take control of the narrative. I started a blog, posting anonymously at first, detailing everything that had happened. The break-ins, the cameras, the revelation, the videos. I wrote about the violation of having someone in my home without permission. The betrayal of learning my entire family history was a lie. The blog went viral within a week. Thousands of people shared their own stories of being stalked by family members, of having boundaries violated by people who claimed to love them. I'd opened a conversation about a topic no one wanted to discuss. A publisher reached out, offering a book deal. They wanted me to expand the blog into a memoir to provide a fuller account of my experience. Kevin thought I should do it, said it would help other victims feel less alone. Amanda agreed, said the psychological insights would be valuable for her field. My parents were hesitant, worried about the attention it would bring to our family, but ultimately they supported my decision. I spent 6 months writing, reliving every moment of those terrible weeks. The book was published a year after Daniel's arrest. It sold better than anyone expected. The success of the book brought more attention. I was invited to speak at conferences about stalking and domestic violence. Victims' advocacy groups wanted me to share my story. I became a reluctant public figure, the face of a movement I'd never intended to join, but the work felt meaningful. Every time someone told me my story had helped them escape an abusive situation or report a stalker, I felt like the trauma had served a purpose. Daniel had taken so much from me. I was taking something back by helping others. Daniel's lawyer contacted me through official channels, requesting an interview for a documentary about his client. The documentary would explore mental illness in the criminal justice system, using Daniel's case as a primary example. The lawyer said Daniel had given his full consent and hoped I'd participate. I declined immediately. I'd told my story on my own terms. I wouldn't participate in anything that centered Daniel's perspective or generated sympathy for him. The documentary was made anyway, without my involvement. It painted Daniel as a sympathetic figure, a man failed by the mental health system. The critics loved it. 6 months later, I received a letter from Daniel's other daughter, the one in Oregon. Her name was Stephanie, and she was 23. She'd seen my book and recognized our shared father. She wrote that Daniel had tried to contact her when she was 18, had shown up at her college claiming he wanted to be part of her life. She'd gotten a restraining order too. Now she wanted to connect with me, to compare experiences, to know she wasn't alone. We started emailing, then talking on the phone. She became the sister I didn't know I needed. Stephanie told me about the son in Florida, our half-brother Nathan. He was 25 and wanted nothing to do with Daniel or anyone connected to him. His mother had warned him about Daniel when he was young, had prepared him for the possibility that his father might try to make contact. When Daniel had shown up at his apartment 3 years ago, Nathan had called the police immediately. He'd been terrified, convinced Daniel would hurt him. Stephanie had tried to reach out to Nathan several times, but he never responded. Some wounds were too deep for family connections to heal. The three of us existed in this strange constellation. Siblings who'd never known each other, connected only by a man who'd abandoned all of us. Stephanie and I grew close over the following year. We visited each other, shared stories about our lives, built a relationship based on choice rather than biology. She met Kevin and Amanda, who welcomed her into our family. My parents treated her warmly, though I could see the discomfort in my mother's eyes. Every time she looked at Stephanie, she was reminded of Daniel's other life, the family he'd built after leaving us. Daniel's sentence was coming to an end. 18 months had passed, and he'd be released on probation soon. Officer Delgado called to warn me, to make sure I knew the restraining order was still active. Daniel would be required to attend therapy, maintain employment, and check in with his probation officer weekly. Any violation would send him back to prison. Delgado said Daniel had been a model prisoner, had attended every counseling session, had completed a program for offenders with mental health issues. He wanted me to know Daniel seemed genuinely changed, I thanked him, but said it didn't matter. Changed or not, Daniel was forbidden from ever contacting me. The day of his release, I took down all the cameras. Kevin thought I was crazy, but I explained that I'd lived under surveillance for too long. Daniel's cameras, my own cameras, the constant monitoring had become its own kind of prison. I wanted to live without watching, without being watched. I wanted to trust that the legal system would protect me, that the restraining order meant something. Kevin reluctantly helped me remove the equipment. My house felt naked without the cameras, vulnerable, but also free. 3 weeks after Daniel's release, I saw him at a grocery store. He was in the produce section, selecting apples, looking thinner than he had in court. I froze, my hand gripping the shopping cart. He saw me too, and his face went pale. We stared at each other across the display of fruit. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. He set down the apples and walked quickly in the opposite direction, leaving his cart behind. I stood there shaking, watching him disappear around the corner. He'd kept his distance, had obeyed the restraining order, but seeing him in person brought everything back. I reported the encounter to his probation officer, who assured me Daniel hadn't violated any terms. Being in the same public space wasn't illegal as long as he didn't approach or speak to me. She said Daniel had reported the encounter too, had called her immediately after leaving the store. He'd been terrified I'd think he was following me. The probation officer said Daniel was living in a supervised facility for people transitioning out of prison, that he was working at a warehouse and attending therapy twice a week. She said he asked about me sometimes, wanted to know if I was okay. She never told him anything. Stephanie called that night. She'd had her own encounter with Daniel. He'd sent her a letter through his lawyer, asking if they could meet. The letter was apologetic and humble, asking only for a chance to explain himself. Stephanie didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted answers, wanted to understand why he'd abandoned her mother, but she was also terrified of being disappointed again. I told her about my decision not to have contact, explained my reasoning. I also said her situation was different from mine. She'd never experienced the stalking, the violation. She had to make her own choice. Stephanie met with Daniel 3 weeks later. She called me afterward crying. Daniel had apologized, had explained that he'd been young and stupid and terrified of being a father. He said he'd made the same mistake 3 times, had run from responsibility every time it got too hard. Meeting Stephanie had broken something in him, had made him realize what he'd lost. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only acknowledged the harm he'd caused. Stephanie said he seemed genuinely remorseful, but she didn't know if remorse was enough. She'd agreed to have lunch with him again the following month. She wanted to give him a chance. I felt betrayed initially. Stephanie's choice to meet Daniel felt like a rejection of my boundary, but Amanda helped me understand that Stephanie's relationship with Daniel was separate from mine. She hadn't experienced what I had, didn't carry the same trauma. Her path to healing might include contact with our biological father. My path required distance. Both were valid. I called Stephanie and apologized for my initial reaction. I told her I supported whatever decision she made, even if it was different from mine. The book continued to sell, and I continued to speak publicly about stalking and boundaries. I became an advocate for stronger restraining order enforcement, for better resources for stalking victims. The work gave me purpose, transformed my trauma into something useful, but it also meant I could never fully leave that period of my life behind. Every speech, every interview, every book signing required me to relive the worst months of my experience. Diana worried I was re-traumatizing myself, that I needed to step back. I told her I'd stop when the work stopped mattering. 2 years after Daniel's release, Stephanie called with unexpected news. Daniel had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. The doctor said the progression would be rapid, that he'd likely need full-time care within a year. Daniel had asked Stephanie to tell me, had hoped I'd want to know. I felt nothing at first, then guilt, then anger that he was trying to manipulate me even now, using illness to generate sympathy. Stephanie said she didn't think it was manipulation. Daniel's cognitive decline was real and documented. He wasn't asking to see me, just wanted me to know the truth. I struggled with what to do with this information. Part of me felt vindicated that he'd faced decline and loss the way he'd caused decline and loss in others. Part of me felt sad for the man who'd wasted his life running from responsibility. Mostly I felt tired. Tired of Daniel occupying space in my thoughts. Tired of his presence casting a shadow over my present. I told Stephanie I didn't want updates about his condition. I wished him no harm, but I also didn't want to know. She understood and agreed to keep Daniel's health private between her and him. Kevin got married that spring. His wedding was beautiful, filled with family and friends. Stephanie came, having become a true part of our family. She'd grown close to Amanda too, the 3 of us forming a bond that felt more real than biology. At the reception, my father pulled me aside. He said he'd been thinking about forgiveness, about whether I owed Daniel anything. I told him I'd already forgiven Daniel for abandoning me as a child. What I couldn't forgive was the stalking, the violation, the year of terror. My father nodded and said he understood. He told me he was proud of how I'd handled everything, proud of the woman I'd become. The cameras had been gone for 3 years when my house was broken into again. This time it was an actual burglary. Someone had smashed the back door while I was at work and stolen my television and laptop. I called the police and gave my statement. Officer Delgado responded, "Now a sergeant." He asked if I wanted to reinstall the security system. I said no. This was a normal crime, the kind that happened to anyone. I wouldn't let fear dictate how I lived. Delgado seemed impressed by that answer. He said I'd come a long way from the terrified woman he'd met 4 years ago. Daniel died 8 months after his diagnosis. Stephanie called to tell me, her voice heavy with grief. She'd been visiting him regularly at the care facility, had watched his mind deteriorate rapidly. Toward the end, he hadn't recognized her. She'd held his hand as he passed, this man who'd failed her so completely but who'd also given her life. She asked if I wanted to come to the funeral. I said no. My grieving for Daniel had happened years ago. His death changed nothing. Stephanie understood but said she wished things could have been different. I told her they could have been. Daniel had chosen otherwise. The probation office notified me officially of Daniel's death. The restraining order was now void, obviously. They asked if I wanted the personal effects Daniel had left behind. There wasn't much. Some clothes, a few books, and a box of photos. I almost refused, but curiosity won. They mailed me the box. Inside were pictures of me at every age. Photos he must have collected somehow, copied from my social media, or obtained from mutual acquaintances. Photos of me as a baby, a child, a teenager, an adult. He'd created a visual history of the daughter he'd never known. Also in the box was a letter, sealed, with my name written on the envelope. I kept the letter unopened for 3 weeks. Finally, with Diana sitting beside me, I read it. Daniel had written it shortly after his diagnosis, while his mind was still clear. He wrote that he knew I'd never forgive him, that he didn't deserve forgiveness. He wrote about the regret that had consumed his life, the knowledge that he'd destroyed the most important relationships through his own cowardice. He explained that the stalking had started as a way to feel close to me, but had become an obsession he couldn't control. He wrote that he'd gotten help in prison, had finally understood the depth of his illness. He ended by saying he hoped I'd live a beautiful life, surrounded by people who loved me properly, people who showed up and stayed. I cried after reading it, not for Daniel, but for the waste of it all. The wasted years, the wasted opportunities, the wasted potential for healing. He'd been capable of insight, of understanding his failures. But that insight had come too late to change anything. I filed the letter away with all the other documents from that period of my life. Evidence of what had happened. Proof that I'd survived it. The box of photos I gave to Stephanie. She'd known him at the end. She deserved to have the full picture of who he'd been. 5 years after the first break-in, I sold my house. Not because of Daniel or the memories, but because I'd outgrown it. I was ready for something new. A fresh start unconnected to that period of my life. I bought a larger house in a different neighborhood, one with better light, and a garden where I could grow vegetables. Kevin helped me move, along with Amanda and Stephanie. My parents came too, my father carrying boxes while my mother directed where everything should go. We were a family, built not from biology, but from choice and commitment. The new house had no cameras, no security system beyond basic locks. I'd learned that safety doesn't come from surveillance. It comes from community, from people who notice when something's wrong, from legal protections that actually work. I'd learned that you can't prevent every violation, every intrusion. You can only decide how you'll respond when it happens. I'd chosen to respond with action, with advocacy, with the determination to help others avoid what I'd experienced. I still think about those nights watching Daniel on camera, trying to understand what drove him. The psychology of it remains fascinating and horrifying. A man so desperate for connection that he'd commit crimes to feel close to a daughter who didn't know him. So convinced that biology created obligation that he'd violated every boundary. Amanda finished her dissertation, and it won awards in her field. She'd used Daniel's case with my permission to explore how family relationships can become pathological, how love can twist into obsession when someone refuses to accept loss. The cameras gave me truth, but they also showed me something I hadn't expected. They showed me my own strength, my capacity to survive violation and trauma. They showed me that I could face the worst parts of my past and come out stronger. Daniel thought the cameras would catch him, would prove his presence. Instead, they proved mine. They showed a woman who refused to be a victim, who fought back, who demanded justice. That's who I am now. Not the daughter Daniel abandoned or the target of his obsession. Just Natalie, whole and free. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.